Hello everybody and welcome to the Functional Health Podcast with Ben Atkinson. This week I was delighted to speak to Lorraine Nicolle. Lorraine is an incredible nutritional therapist, author, speaker and educator, and in our conversation today we dive into the fundamental causes of exhaustion or fatigue and how to overcome it. This is something that affects everyone, and it will affect you at some point in your life, so this information can be so useful. I first actually met Lorraine at a Pharmanord practitioner seminar she was giving in London, and she's brilliant. You'll enjoy this one. So, Lorraine, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ben. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Lorraine, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on. And it's lovely to have you on to talk about fatigue, tiredness, exhaustion, something that plagues, I think, everyone at some point in their life, right?
Oh, gosh, absolutely. So anyone who's a practitioner will be seeing people, no doubt, day in, day out, who are suffering from some level of fatigue that isn't normal, fatigue that affects their quality of life, whether or not they've got a chronic illness or whether they haven't had a diagnosis of anything. I think fatigue is just so common, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I mean, above and beyond the kind of normal drivers, right? I often hear friends or family members saying like, oh, they're so tired and they don't know why. And actually they were watching Netflix until 2 a.m. So I think things like that, you can kind of understand why people are tired, even if they don't realize themselves. But let's start really big picture here. So what actually is fatigue? How do you define it?
Okay, so fatigue, if you look at a medical definition of fatigue or exhaustion, which are kind of used interchangeably, it's really about a level of tiredness that is inappropriate and goes on so for example, your friend's watching Netflix till 2 a.m. You're supposed to be tired. That's perfectly normal. So that's not abnormal fatigue. There's nothing to treat. You just need to go to bed a bit earlier. But fatigue to be treated is that which goes on and that which affects your quality of life day to day. And there's two main categories. Primary fatigue is the fatigue that exists without any other diagnosed health condition being present. So it's not secondary to anything else. There's no immediate obvious cause. And then secondary fatigue is the fatigue that is symptomatic of an underlying medical disease. And then, of course, what you're doing is you're trying to help manage that disease in order to relieve the fatigue, because there are masses of different diseases which will have fatigue as part of their symptomology. There's the classic ones like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, but there's lots of pain syndromes as well, like migraine, inflammatory diseases, autoimmune diseases, things like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Crohn's disease, even heart disease, COPD, renal failure, diabetes can make people feel very tired. And then you've got sort of neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's, liver diseases, infectious diseases like hepatitis, neuroimmunological diseases like multiple sclerosis. There are so many different types of diseases which will have fatigue at their core. And I suppose in those cases, you really do want to help that person manage that condition. But in many cases, people are coming and they haven't had a chronic illness that explains their fatigue.
I mean, that makes sense. So do you think primary fatigue would be more like very basic terms, like a dysfunction, where like secondary fatigue, you'd almost like post-viral fatigue? We often hear of long COVID. That's a big buzzword.
Well, I think the two go hand in hand, because I think anybody suffering with long-term fatigue, whether or not they've got a diagnosed medical illness, there's always going to be some pattern of underlying dysfunction, isn't there? So I guess whatever they come to you with, you're always trying to do the same thing, which is investigate what are those underlying dysfunctions and put right as well as you can those underlying dysfunctionals. And that's what we do in functional healthcare, isn't it? That's the whole point of it. We're not so much interested in what is this diagnosis, what is this label that you've been given. We're much more interested to understand why, what's actually happening, how are all your body systems working, and what sort of what sort of nutrient status do you have that might be affecting those body systems? And I would do that with everybody who walks through the door with fatigue.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there's so many people that I feel experience fatigue at all different levels, primary and secondary. Is there any data on prevalence of how this affects people?
Yes, there is actually. There's quite a lot of data. I mean, well, in terms of, it depends, it really depends what you're looking at, because so I do have some prevalence statistics, but I don't have them right in front of me. But I know they're much higher than we would ordinarily think they are, Ben. That's the thing. So if we're looking at, say, fatigue that is part of chronic fatigue, then there was a systematic review in 2023, just last year, showing that as much as 10% of the worldwide population may be suffering from chronic fatigue, 20% for general fatigue, which doesn't give you the diagnosis of chronic fatigue because that has a specific diagnosis, but 20% that just is generalized fatigue. We also know that it's one of the most frequent presenting complaints in primary care. And in fact, there was a community-based postal survey many years ago, but it's still cited by NICE today, where they looked at a sample of almost 2,500 adults from 20 GP practices. And they found that 50% of people with chronic diseases reported feeling tired or run down. And they also reported that fatigue was the most commonly reported symptom out of 25 possible symptoms of chronic disease. So it's really, really common. And there are all sorts of scales that can be used for measuring fatigue if people want to get into the numbers of it. I mean, they're very easy to just sort of look up online. I think that's what some people might, if you like quantifying things, there are lots of different scales out there now that you can use to sort of rate somebody's fatigue and then rate them, say, 3 or 6 months later to see if your intervention program is helping. But yeah, it's very, very, very common, very prevalent.
I mean, those numbers are stark. And it seems there are very few interventions to actually help manage this condition, at least conventionally. And I think functional health has a lot to play here.
Yeah. That really is where a functional healthcare approach can help, because really on the NHS and, well, in all kind of allopathic healthcare, I guess what we're talking about is helping people to live with their fatigue, referring people on for individualized exercise therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. And if drugs are given, it tends to be things like non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs to manage any pain associated with the fatigue. We see that a lot in long COVID, for example. And also sometimes people are given antidepressants. So all of these things can help with symptoms, but of course, they're not really getting to that root cause. And it's only when you get to the root causes and you start addressing those that you can really give people a strong chance of recovery from their fatigue.
Absolutely. So when we talk about root causes, what do you think are or maybe we can start with, what do you think are the most common drivers of exhaustion, of fatigue?
Well, yeah, I think there are lots of them, and if we think about the different body systems that we look at when we're addressing anyone with kind of unexplained illness, so certainly I'd be looking at nutrient deficiencies, things like iron and B12, chronic pain, inflammation, intestinal hyperpermeability and dysbiosis, so functional gut disorders, toxic load, oxidative stress, leakiness of the blood-brain barrier, hypoglycemia, HPA, so the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysfunction, also thyroid issues, hormonal problems like menopause, and mitochondrial dysfunction as well, which is far more prevalent now than we thought even 5 or 10 years ago, some level of mitochondrial underperformance. So, there are just masses of different things to look at, which should make us be feeling pretty positive as practitioners, I guess, because there's so many different things, so many different options that we have for, helping somebody really.
Yeah, and these are often distinct problems, but incredibly interlinked. Like normally when you tackle one, you help another. I mean, thyroidism, I actually did a whole podcast on this and talking about subclinical hypothyroidism, which I think is something which, often doesn't get picked up in conventional testing, but can have real efficacy in terms of treating people with it. So I'll link to that in the show notes for people if they want to check that out. But circling back to nutrient deficiency, you mentioned iron, and this is something I found absolutely fascinating because I came across data looking at, and this commonly affects people in third world countries where iron really isn't in the diet, and it can affect IQ for children even at a young age, as well as energy levels. So let's dive into a little bit there. And maybe talking about the UK and the US in general. Normally,
I mean, that's a really good point you've made, actually, because iron's really important for brain development, and also for just getting oxygen to the brain. So yeah, absolutely crucial in all populations.
I often hear of iron overload more so than iron deficiency, but I think that's probably due to men overeating red meat potentially, or I'm not sure.
That's interesting. I mean, it's iron overload, I think, is rarer than iron deficiency. I think iron insufficiency rather than true deficiency, I'll explain the difference in a minute, is probably way more common. And in fact, iron is one of several micronutrients that have actually got a European health claim approved in terms of helping with fatigue. The other ones are things like B vitamins, magnesium and zinc. But the reason that iron is so important is not only because it goes into making hemoglobin. And, hemoglobin is within our red blood cells and it carries oxygen to all our tissues to make us feel energized. But that's, the number one reason that we need iron. But there are other reasons as well. So you've already touched on one, Ben, when you mentioned the thyroid, because remember, we need iron to make thyroxine. We need iron to make T4. So we can have suboptimal thyroid function, not because of, for example, it might not be anything to do with autoimmunity, it might not be Hashimoto's, it might just be a nutrient deficiency, it might be low iron. And then we also need iron for the functioning of the cytochrome enzymes within the mitochondria, within the electron transport chain. And of course, that's where we make our energy. So it's really important on so many levels that we are iron sufficient. Not just for hemoglobin, for energy. And if we're eating I mean, you just talked about various different populations that were low in iron. If we are eating a omnivore diet, then it's pretty easy to replace the iron that we lose every day. But some people need more iron because they might be going through growth states, for example, adolescence or the fetus. And some people lose a lot of iron, like menstruating women. So, and some people don't replace all of that, perhaps because then they're eating 100% plant-based diets, which obviously give us masses of good things, but we don't absorb iron from plants as well as we absorb iron from animal products. So it can be tricky to be optimal in iron if we are not eating animal products. So it's not that you have to eat animal products, it's just that you have to take care. You have to be very careful about how you are, that you are getting that iron, I guess. Do you want me to explain why that is, Ben? Would it be helpful to explain the difference in
yes, that would
types
be great.
of iron in food?
I think non-human heme iron, right? That's the big thing. And even though, because I remember one of my friends was saying, I definitely get all my iron. And she was tracking her iron on an app, saying that she gets the right amount of iron for her on a daily basis, but was all coming from plants. And actually she was iron deficient. And it's absorption, right? I believe. For Lorraine?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got it spot on, because heme iron is a type of iron that we get from, meat or dark-coloured fish, or even dark-coloured poultry, so chicken legs, for example. And that's really easy for humans to absorb. It's absorbed directly into the duodenal cells. It's broken down to release, well, it's broken down very easily, and then it's stored in a form called ferritin. So usually people will get their ferritin levels measured in order to see how iron sufficient they are. But then non-heme iron, which we get, for example, from spinach, there's masses of iron in spinach, but it isn't the right sort of iron. It's not the same type of iron, so you can't absorb as much of it. First of all, with that non-heme iron, you've got to have sufficient levels of hydrochloric acid in the stomach, because that acid will activate an enzyme called ferrireductase, and the ferrireductase, which are in the duodenal cells, will reduce that non-heme iron to a type of iron that can then be stored as ferritin and used by humans. So you need to have good levels of stomach acid. You also need, actually, it's a good idea to have some vitamin C with your spinach if you want to get more iron out of it. So if you've got poor stomach acid levels, like, for example, anybody on a proton pump inhibitor, or who might have an H. pylori infection, or who might be under long-term stress, so perhaps they're not producing stomach acid very well, then they're going to have a harder time of absorbing that iron from the spinach. And the other thing that's in plant foods, of course, is oxalates. And oxalates combined iron, which further reduce its absorption. So you're absolutely right. We get, or your friend was absolutely right, probably intaking loads of iron, but not necessarily absorbing it all. And so anybody who is 100% plant-based, I think, should do a ferritin test to check that actually they are iron sufficient.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think phytic acid also plays a role, right? So people eating lots of nuts and seeds along with their food. So even like putting nuts on top of a salad, often you get those polyphenols, high fiber, etc. There's lots of benefits potentially to adding nuts to certain meals. But in terms of iron absorption, it's actually doing the exact opposite of what you need potentially.
Yeah. And it's so easy to measure ferritin. I really think it's important to do. And it's a really good marker of whether you're iron sufficient, just that one single marker. There are some times when it's not sufficient on its own. I mean, I suppose if you suspect that somebody is suffering from inflammation as well, then ferritin is not a good marker, because often you can see very elevated ferritin because it is an acute phase protein and will elevate in the same way that C-reactive protein does if you're in a state of inflammation. So you can't rely on your ferritin marker if you're in a state of inflammation. But if you're not in a state of inflammation, then ferritin is quite a good marker. If you do suspect inflammation, then you'd want to probably do a full iron panel and look at all the other iron markers in the bloodstream as well. But I'd start with ferritin.
Yeah, and you mentioned different stages in life. I mean, this is obviously different for men and women, right? So a man on a plant-based diet, I imagine, because they're not losing as much iron during their menstruating phase, for example, because they don't have one. So therefore, would it actually be much of a risk for a male being on a plant-based diet over a female?
You're absolutely right. Of course, if you're not losing it every month, then you're going to be preserving a lot more, and you're not going to be nearly as much at risk. There are other ways to lose iron, of course. So if you have an undiagnosed gastric ulcer, maybe you can lose iron. Or people who are extremely athletic, marathon runners, for example, because you can lose iron through red cell lysis with a lot of running. So it is so easy to check it. You may as well just check it and know where you are, to know whether you are eating the right sort of diet for you, or whether you need to, if you want to remain 100% plant-based, possibly put in some supplementation now and then if you need to.
Yeah, that's really important. I think people often shy away from supplementation because they think they can get everything from their food. But I think depending on your diet and actually just function of your body, like you mentioned, gut health just before, and different types of things which can reduce your iron absorption, I think it can be very necessary and often very beneficial in the short term, or indeed the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. Infants as well, breast milk tends to be quite low in iron. So sometimes infants can be low in iron. And as I said before, rapidly growing children and adolescents, they have a much greater iron demand. So look at your teenage girls who want to be plant-based and they're losing a lot of blood every month, and they are growing. They need lots of iron for growth. So look at that population as well.
You actually mentioned low stomach acid before in terms of iron absorption. The same is true for B12, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. In fact, B12 seems to have this ridiculously lengthy pathway for absorption, doesn't it? I mean, why? Why?
I know.
Why has the human body been made like this? It's so hard for us to absorb B12. It has to go through so many different stages in the gut. Because first of all, of course, we need the parietal cells to produce stomach acid. We need the chief cells to produce pepsin to break down the protein so that we can release our B12 from food. But then we need the intrinsic factor to be released, and we also need other binders to be released in the gut, called transcobalamin 1, for example, which carries B12 further down the gut to intrinsic factor, so that intrinsic factor can then help B12 to be absorbed. So it just has to go through so many different stages. It's not surprising that B12 deficiency is actually quite common. And again, people who are 100% plant-based, I think everyone who's vegan, well, it knows that, I would hope it would know anyway, that you cannot get any B12 from plant-based products. So you would need to supplement B12 in that instance. Yeah. But B12, low B12 is very much linked to fatigue, just like iron is. I mean, actually, something we didn't mention, Ben, of course, is that if you're very low in iron, so if your ferritin is below, say, 15, you'll be diagnosed with anemia, a type of anemia that we call microcytic. The red cells are too small to function properly, and you can't get enough oxygen to tissues. If you, but by the way, having your ferritin below 15 is extremely low. And even if it's below 30, you're probably too low for optimal energy. You really want your ferritin to be about 50. And then with B12, you can also get a type of anemia if you're low in B12, but it's a different type of anemia. It's called macrocytic, and that's when the red cells are too large and they're not functioning properly. So again, you'll become exhausted if you're low in B12. And you can measure that. Again, you can measure your B12 levels in the blood. You can also measure an organic acid in the urine or the blood called methylmalonic acid, which is thought to be a better marker of B12 because it's more of a functional marker of the B12 that's actually active inside your cells and is helping you to be energized and do all the other wonderful things that it does.
Just to dive into that a little bit more and go super niche for a second. So the lower esophageal sphincter, some people can have issues with that actually closing and then are on omeprazole to reduce stomach acid so they don't get GERD and all these kinds of issues. Would that actually reduce the absorption even if those individuals did supplement because of the lower stomach acid?
Absolutely it would, wouldn't it? Because yes, so if you're on omeprazole or any kind of proton pump inhibitor or anything that inhibits stomach acid, you are also going to be inhibiting, you're going to be inhibiting then the release of B12 from food and iron from food, actually. But you're also going to be inhibiting intrinsic factor because intrinsic factor is released from the same cells as the acid. It's released from the parietal cells. So I'm pretty sure that PPIs are quite well acknowledged for reducing B12 absorption, actually. So in those cases, you'd probably want to take B12 through like a pastil, a lozenge that you'd suck in the mouth so it can be absorbed through the mucous membranes. Or, of course, what some people do is they go and have their 3 monthly B12 injections. But I think sometimes when you have the 3 monthly injections, you can feel really energized in the first half of the month. And then as you come up towards your next injection, you're feeling quite tired again. So some people prefer to take a lozenge more regularly to even out the B12 levels.
Yeah, and then you can also get a spray as well, which I assume would do the same if you're just absorbing it sublingually. Yeah. In terms of because you can get different. You can get different types of B12, methylcobalamin, adenosine, and also hydroxycobalamin. Have you got a preference, and why would that be the case?
Do you know, I don't think I know enough about the different types to know if there is one that is definitively better, but I tend to use methylcobalamin simply because there is some research that it has good tissue retention, perhaps less urinary excretion than cyanocobalamin, for example. And we know that methylcobalamin can be used directly in the methyl cycle, which is really important because one of the problems that we can have if B12 goes too low is elevated homocysteine and poor methylation. And in fact, that itself can drive fatigue because methylation is used. It's a process that we use for making our adrenal hormones, for example, the catecholamines like adrenaline and noradrenaline, which gives us those short spurts of energy. But also, if we're not methylating properly, our homocysteine can elevate, and elevated homocysteine is inflammatory. And one of the other underlying drivers for exhaustion is ongoing inflammation, just kind of low-grade inflammation that you wouldn't necessarily see as redness and swelling, but is there nonetheless, and is driving the fatigue. So yeah, so I tend to use methylcobalamin, but it might be that other types of B12 have an effect. I haven't compared the literature sufficiently, Ben, to be able to be definitive on whether you need to take all three of them or that there are different types that are better at different times.
Well, I think you've given a robust argument as to why methyl might be a preference for most individuals, especially because inflammation is a leading driver of or underlying factor in many chronic health conditions, not just fatigue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there any, because obviously we think about B vitamins for us giving us energy, and we mentioned B12. Is there any ones, I'm rattling my brain here, but I can't think of any, that would be affected massively by gut integrity or indeed diet itself?
Any nutrients, you mean?
Nutrients, B vitamins, etc.
Yes. So, I mean, pretty much everything could be affected, couldn't it, really? If we have, because I guess this leads us on to another cause of underlying fatigue, whether it's due to nutrient malabsorption or not.
Mm-hmm.
So functional gut issues, and really, yeah. So things like dysbiosis, whether that is a SIBO or whether that's colonic dysbiosis, things like intestinal hyperpermeability, very much linked to fatigue. I mean, everybody practicing, any practitioners who might be listening today will be very, very used to seeing clients who have got this unrelenting brain fog, which can be linked to dysbiosis, can't it? So, a bacterial overgrowth or a yeast overgrowth, because some of these bacterial overgrowths can then cause the production of lipopolysaccharides, which can be absorbed across the gut barrier, especially if the gut barrier is a bit leaky. And then that causes endotoxicity, which can really cause brain fog. And if you get any inflammation from that, by the way, that can then drive blood-brain barrier leakiness. Mm-hmm. And blood-brain barrier leakiness can then cause massive brain fog, even dizziness, and really severe mental fatigue, and even kind of emotional fatigue. So you can feel very low and depressed, and lose your kind of mojo, and just be very apathetic, feel very apathetic. So any type of dysbiosis, so overgrowths of proteobacteria, for example, that can be linked to elevated lipopolysaccharides, or even overgrowths of yeasts like Candida albicans have been linked to brain fog, probably through the leaky gut mechanism as well, because the yeasts produce those little tentacles that we call hyphae that can burrow into the gut lining and cause the leakiness. And we know that too much leakiness drives inflammation, and that is through the gut lining, but also, as I've just said, that can also be through the blood-brain barrier, because if we have any leakiness in the blood-brain barrier, then anything getting through that wouldn't ordinarily be allowed through will trigger the microglia in the brain, and they will then start producing lots of inflammation in the brain, which then disrupts synaptic activity and the production of neurochemicals, and can really cause a lot of mental fatigue.
Yeah, and that's really important. I think whenever someone is ill, there's a natural amount of inflammation that will happen for your body to fight the infection, with like this activation of the immune cells, microglia being some of them localized in the brain. But sustained amounts is what causes the real issue, right? If I have a cold, like brain fog is one of the first symptoms I get, for sure. But then it doesn't last that long. The cold goes away and I am back to normal. But people can have this consistently, right? Especially with these chronic gut issues.
Yes.
I am
absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, don't say sorry at all. It's hard online, I think, sometimes to not talk over each other. But I had, I'll admit this now. So I had dysbiosis. So I know symptoms that my gut was awry that I could put my finger on. I couldn't figure it out. I had these like potential brain fog, things like that. Did a gut test, figured out I had dysbiosis within my gut. And this was causing various different types of brain fog. And I was trying to figure out why, because my diet overall is pretty good compared to most people, right? Let's just put it that way.
I would expect it to be, yeah.
And if anyone, I often get taken the mick out of from my friends, occasionally like, oh, he's allergic to carbohydrates or something like that. And I do eat carbs, but it's strategically, right? And various different high polyphenol foods. We eat 100% cacao, dark chocolate, things like that. So people think I'm very healthy and therefore everything about me must be in good nick. That's not always the case. And even people that live a good lifestyle can have an infection. Maybe they've traveled to another country and had something that troubled their gut, and that causes long-lasting effects. And it's only since I had this test where I had to tackle that and alleviated this brain fog, which I had for over a year, where it was really bad. And for me, especially someone who likes to be driven and basically taking on many projects at once, it was an absolute nightmare. And I can imagine people just live with this all the time and don't realize what the underlying cause is.
Wow. So did you change your diet as part of that?
I mean,
even though you were on a very good diet.
It was careful supplementation, I think, for me, which really changed the game. I also had H. pylori at the time. Again, no symptoms that I could really test apart from this brain fog and mental fatigue. But actually tackling that.
Well, that will do it. Just having H. pylori, won't it? Yeah, yes. Because of course H. pylori then diminishes your digestive capacity in the stomach, and then that diminishes the digestive capacity all the way down the gut. So you end up having undigested food molecules further down in the gut, and that will just garner yeast and bacteria to it. They'll be having a field day and they'll proliferate like crazy. Because of course you can get dysbiosis, which isn't sort of what we'd call a pathogenic dysbiosis, but it's just an imbalance. You can get a dysbiosis because you've got too much of a healthful type of bacteria or other type of bug.
Yeah,
and that can.
I'd like to say that was the case, Lorraine, but I'm not sure it was.
Okay. Well, anyway, well done for sorting it out.
Yeah, I think it's a constant battle as well. Sometimes just to make sure, because even when you try and correct something, if you don't change the underlying environment, like if you have chronic inflammation or something, your body can naturally shift back to what it was before. So it's about tackling everything holistically, right? Not just isolating the problem and then solving that, because it can always flick back if you don't deal with everything.
And that is such a challenge, isn't it, to try and do everything holistically, because there are always barriers. Sometimes you can get the diet right, but it's really hard to manage the stress or improve the sleep. It's really hard to do everything. But
you picked up an important point with the H. pylori, because obviously if that affects stomach acid secretion and also digestive enzymes, it's going to affect iron, B12, and the absorption of all the other nutrients, which are going to lead to this fatigue anyway. When you talk about leaky gut, what are the underlying primary causes there?
So leaky gut can be caused by when we look at what the literature says about it, and also any practitioner listening will kind of know this from seeing clients in their practice. People who are under chronic stress, that is a driver of leaky gut. So, for example, if you're not getting enough sleep, or if you're over-exercising, or if you're sedentary, all those things can cause leaky gut. Um, Certain medications, so steroids are well known for causing gut leakiness. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs can. Certain types of dysbiosis, as we mentioned earlier, I think with the yeast overgrowth, for example, or if there's any sort of dysbiotic issue that is causing inflammation in the gut, because anything that's inflammatory in the gut will cause gut leakiness. So excessive use of alcohol, for example, excessive use of alcohol has been shown to drive lipopolysaccharide translocation into the bloodstream and cause endotoxemia, which will make you exhausted.
So it's not just a hangover.
Yeah. No. No, but that hangover is telling you something, isn't it? Telling us that you probably need to calm it down a bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there is this, and anything, I suppose, that your gut does not like. So in some people, so certain foods that you genetically or epigenetically might not be able to tolerate well. And for some people, that might be gluten, for example, but not for everybody. But it's a very personalized thing, what's going to cause this leakiness. Although we do know there are some main things like the drugs I've mentioned and the poor sleep and the long-term stress. But yeah, you'd need to look deeply into what's going on inside the gut that might be causing that.
I think dysbiosis is certainly a big one. And I think when you think, looking back, I had chronic skin issues, like chronic acne when I was younger. And the amount of cycles of antibiotics I had to deal with that. And eventually I had Roaccutane. Yeah. But I can't imagine that did anything good to my gut microbiome. And I was probably taking them twice a year for chronic throat infections and, my skin. So you don't think at the time. We know a lot more than we did back then.
Absolutely. And you can totally see how that happens, because we've got plenty of research showing that if you decimate your gut bacteria, so you've talked about antibiotics, which is one surefire way of decimating your gut bacteria, isn't it? Or if you do it through just having a long-term ultra processed food diet, so you're not feeding your microbiome, then you're far more likely to end up with such a narrow range of bugs in the gut that you just can't produce anti-inflammatory energy-giving molecules like short-chain fatty acids, like in butyrate, for example. But if you were to eat a Mediterranean-style diet, really rich in fibers and all those lovely polyphenols that we always talk about, then you're going to have a very broad-based, diverse microbiome, and that is much better for energy. And there are studies now linking those two extremes, really, in diet, to sharper thinking and a reduction of brain fog if you switch from one to the other over time, because of that improvement in microbiome diversity, microbial diversity in the gut. So we can't really afford to ignore the gut, I guess. And I think every nutritionist listening to this will know that anyway.
Yes,
we've got to look at the gut.
Absolutely. And I think if we focused on the gut now in relation to fatigue, it would take over the entire podcast. But what we know is absolutely intrinsically linked to fatigue and vitality.
Yes. Yeah. Whether it's through inflammation, or whether it's through nutrient deficiency, or whether it's through just feeling. If you think about it, if you've got a dysbiosis and you just feel really, really bloated and gassy, that after eating is going to make you feel exhausted, isn't it? You're not going to feel like getting up and going out and going to a party. You're just going to want to lie in front of Netflix and stay up till 2 a.m. and then feel even more tired.
All these dysbiotic Netflix loving people. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, even just, I know if something's not settled right that I've eaten, I feel exhausted. It feels heavy in your stomach. And then, it definitely affects my energy levels and my mood. So just echoing everything that you've just alluded to.
Yeah.
As a dedicated listener of my podcast, I'm absolutely sure you're familiar with my enthusiasm for preventative medicine. With preventable chronic diseases now causing 3 out of 5 deaths globally, we need to prioritize health management. Age is the most significant risk factor for chronic diseases, and while we can't alter our age, we can influence how we age on a molecular level, potentially preventing age-related illnesses. This is where the concept of the hallmarks of aging comes into play, with chronic inflammation being a key factor among the 12 hallmarks identified. Glycan age is the first biological age clock to measure chronic inflammation using glycans. Glycans are complex sugar molecules vital for cellular communication that can indicate the risk of 11 diseases up to 10 years in advance. But that's not all. Glycans also reflect your body's response to lifestyle changes, allowing you to actively manage your health. Technologies like these are poised to transform our approach to not only disease prevention, but your own health management, helping to make it more proactive than ever. Visit glycanage.com and use the code FUNCTIONALHEALTH at checkout for an exclusive offer. Take the first step towards a healthier future with Glycanage. Back to the show. At the start of this, you mentioned hypoglycemia playing a big role in energy levels as well. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes. So I think most people are used to thinking they know what the symptoms of hypoglycemia are, right? I mean, so we're all used to, that feeling of being excessively sleepy or feeling irritable or shaky if we're not eating or having eaten something that pushes up our blood glucose levels. But I think there are a lot of people who kind of have become so used to this feeling that they kind of go in and out of hypoglycemia throughout the day because maybe their diets are simply too starchy, or they're under too much stress, or they're drinking too much caffeine. And so it kind of becomes a normalized feeling. But over time, that absolutely does lead to exhaustion. We're kind of now, I think, as well in the sort of life sort of state of society where we know that it's not just eating cornflakes for breakfast that's going to push you into hypoglycemia. It could be, it could be lack of sleep again, or just working too hard and fast, so you're under a lot of stress. It could be certain medications, so steroids, again, beta blockers, some diuretics. It could be too much alcohol. It could be smoking, although not so many people tend to smoke nowadays. It could be just not getting enough exercise. So having a sedentary lifestyle, all of those things can lead to blood glucose problems. And a lot of people are going into hypoglycemia without necessarily eating a really poor diet. I don't know if you noticed this at all, Ben, but I've certainly noticed it. Even in people who are eating what they think of as healthier foods, can go into hypoglycemia relatively easily. In other words, they couldn't go all day without eating. They'd have to eat regularly. Mm-hmm. I have clients who, for example, might be eating what they think of as a healthy bowl of porridge for breakfast, but by mid-morning, they are in need of something else. They're feeling weak and they're feeling tired and they're feeling irritable. And I've wondered whether this might be because of entraining our pancreases over time to overproduce insulin. Those of us who've grown up, I mean, if I think about my childhood, for example, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, where the standard diet was things like Findus crispy pancakes and Angel Delight. So we would have been training those of us who ate like I did. We would have been entraining our pancreases to produce a lot of insulin every time we ate carbohydrate. That because it's an allostatic change, isn't it? This is what the body does. It gradually makes changes to deal with the environment. So I've now got to this point in life, and a lot of people my age will feel the same. Even if you're eating porridge, unless you're making sure that porridge has got a lot of added protein and fat, then just having the starch of the oats might be enough to tell, to tell your pancreas, well, this is a starch, so I need a lot of insulin. And so what I'm finding when I'm doing continuous glucose monitoring, for example, with certain clients, is that they can slip into hypoglycemia without necessarily having a lot of hyperglycemia beforehand, which could be an overproduction of insulin because of many years of entraining the pancreas rather than still having that really poor diet. because, you know, most of us know better now and we're trying to eat well. But
Yes.
not all of us can get away with even the slow release starches sometimes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've never really thought of it that way before. Because maybe I'm prone to that as well. Maybe we all are to a certain degree with maybe reactions to certain foods. Because I'm not sure this happens with me the entire time. You mentioned porridge, and I think that is a good test. For example, if I have, because I tested this, like porridge with water, that's it. I mean, it tastes pretty awful, to be honest. And then, but when I added what I consider functional foods, so like some protein powder, and then I think it was like a tablespoon of almond butter, absolutely fine. I can go 6 hours without any food.
Yeah.
So it dramatically changes the effect on my body, at least. But I know some people thrive off carbohydrates. Their tolerance is way greater than mine is. They can eat a bolus and be absolutely fine. These are quite often my friends, which, you know, I grew up with, and at university they'd eat an entire pizza and then go off and do their work and just feel completely fine. Energy seemed to be at an even keel for many hours. If I did that, I'd be exhausted very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in there, isn't there, Ben? Because that will be partly genetic, partly epigenetic. It also, of course, is going to get worse with age, isn't it? So probably you're a university student, you can get away with a lot more than you can when you get into midlife.
Tell me about it.
But I absolutely get what you're saying about you got to make your porridge more to be kinder to your metabolism, and and you need more protein and fat in there. So I love the almond butter idea. What I also suggest to people, if they really want porridge, is replace half of those porridge oats with ground linseed or flaxseed. Yeah, so you've got a lot more fat and protein and fiber in there, and less starch. And also break an egg or two into your porridge, because it will cook in the porridge. You can just swirl it around, it'll cook in the porridge. And it might sound a bit weird, but it actually just makes the porridge really nice and creamy. And then you've got all that added protein and healthy fat and extra nutrients and choline and vitamin A and all those other wonderful things. And that can really make the porridge into a more macronutrient balanced start to your day.
Not going to lie, Lorraine. I eat very weird things. I eat liver. I say weird. I say people that often but you know, that put their nose up at can't tolerate that. But I eat liver every week. I'm not sure I've ever tried an egg in my porridge, but I might have to. Now you've mentioned
that's a challenge for you. Then
that is a challenge. I will report back for everyone listening.
Brilliant.
Okay, good to know. Good to know with that one. Actually, you've reminded me. There was because you reminded like not just exhaustion, but you mentioned mood earlier. Kelly Brogan didn't coin this phrase, was looking into nutritional psychiatry. She wrote this book, A Mind of Your Own. She's a psychiatrist, but decided to pivot, and rather treating her patients with medications, was using nutrition and lifestyle and various different targeted supplements. And one of the things that she was really focusing on was hypoglycemia. And we're saying the absolute difference it can make to someone's mood for a long period of time when people just have uncontrolled blood sugar is unbelievable. And often something that people misdiagnose as almost like bipolar, or makes that much worse.
Yes, that makes perfect sense, because I mean, I can remember being in hypoglycemic episodes myself and just feeling completely spaced out and exhausted. Really severe symptoms through just eating the wrong type of bread. And actually bread is a big problem, isn't it? Because there just is, it's so hard to buy healthy bread. It's practically impossible to buy healthy bread because, number one, all the sourdoughs tend to be so processed that they don't even contain much fiber at all. And sourdough is a funny thing, isn't it? Because sourdough has now been kind of equated out there as healthy, but almost all the sourdough you buy is not healthy because it's not properly fermented sourdough. And when you look at the flour, when you look at the ingredients, it's not even wholemeal flour. It's often refined flour, but it doesn't look white, does it? So people think they're buying whole grain sourdough, but they're not. And then the other thing, if you want to buy a wholemeal bread, so many of the wholemeal breads have got ingredients lists that are just so long. You know, just so much stuff in there that you don't even know what it is, and you don't necessarily want to eat it. So I think because bread is such a staple, it's that's the thing that really tends to push people over the edge oftentimes, because even those people who are trying to buy healthy bread, unhealthy bread is disguised, so well disguised as healthy bread.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of it's to do with just preserving it. You know, if you go abroad and freshly baking bread is 4 ingredients: water, salt, flour, and yeast, right? And quite often it's just filled with things just to make it last longer on the shelves, weeks, if not a month. I mean, when you mentioned it looks brown and you think you're buying a healthy bread, I've definitely, even the gourmet kind of breads that you buy in the supermarket shelves, I've definitely been burnt before by spending £7 on this wonderful loaf of bread, which is just basically white flour. Yeah, and it is very challenging. I remember there's one, I mean, I shouldn't really, I'll endorse it. So I think it's Waitrose do a spelt sourdough, which is something that people... I mean, I might take this out if I've just realised it's full of rubbish, but I remember looking into this a while ago, and actually spelt flour is quite hard to get hold of, never mind a spelt bread. So yeah, it's something that people can look into.
Yeah, so I always get people to look at the nutritional label on the back and see how many grams of fibre per 100 grams, because in most of the sourdoughs, it's nothing, you know, you need about 9 grams of fibre per 100 grams to know that it's wholemeal, don't you? And almost none of it is anything like that when you're looking at the sourdoughs. I think there is a good brand actually, but it's very expensive, and it's called Heart of Nature, and it happens to be gluten-free. It's mainly oats and seeds, but you don't need very much of it because it's so dense, and you can just keep it in your freezer.
I'm writing that down now.
And it's a lovely bread. Yeah, actually, I wish I hadn't mentioned that, because now there's going to be a shortage of Heart of Nature oat and seed bread.
No, it's always good to know. My partner, she's gluten-free, and I think it's always quite challenging sometimes to find a bread which doesn't contain a load of bad things. There was a micro bakery local to me which produced one, and it was wonderful. It's sadly closed down now, but I knew all those ingredients I could find in a normal larder cupboard, which is wonderful to see, which is very hard.
That's amazing. Yeah. I think Dalesford do a good one as well, actually. I can't remember what it's called, but they do a good one, but again, really expensive, so you'd want to slice it up, put it in your freezer, and just have it from time to time.
Special occasions, birthdays,
Coronation, whenever.
Right, tangents. Right, so we've spoken about so when we were speaking about hypoglycemia, something which gets me is this shakiness. You know, we spoke about mood, like hangry, and people can have these kind of effects. And you mentioned how bread can have this huge effect on blood sugar, because I guess the glycemic load is ridiculous. You know, it's almost like eating pure sugar some of the time, especially when it's low fiber white bread.
Yes.
Are there any foods which you think people just aren't aware of, which will spike your blood sugar in the vast majority of cases way more than people think?
Oh, well, I think it is anything that's made out of those refined flours or just refined grains. So, you know, white rice, white pasta, any bread, basically packed of bread, but, you know, bread, even if it's brown bread, it's processed bread. It's not wholemeal bread. Because everybody knows, of course, about sweets and cakes and things that have got added sugar to them. But it's not just the added sugar, is it? It's the refined flours and refined grains. Alcohol as well, because if you are somebody that wakes up at 3 o'clock every morning and you are an alcohol drinker, that's the biggest thing you can do, isn't it? Just stop the alcohol for a while and see if you can stop that 3 a.m. waking. Because what's happening overnight when you're drinking alcohol in the evening is that you are pushing your blood glucose up and you're going into hypoglycemia in those early hours. Hypoglycemia is stressful for the body, so that is immediately going to trigger the adrenals to produce adrenaline and noradrenaline, and then cortisol. Before you know it, you're wide awake, and of course cortisol is going to suppress your melatonin, so it's going to be hard to get back to sleep. So yeah, alcohol in the evening's not a good idea. And then I think
That's
things
such a
like fruit
valuable
juices.
point. Just to stay on that for a second, I think that's such a
Yeah,
valuable point because even just a glass of wine can cause that to happen.
yeah,
Nocturnal hypoglycemia, and people get this almost like it's almost like someone squeezing. I almost say it's probably a horrible way to describe it, but someone's like squeezing adrenaline out my adrenal glands because I've had this
yeah,
before, and I'm just like, oh,
yeah,
I'm awake now. It's 3 o'clock
yeah,
in the morning. I didn't need that. But yeah, it can happen with low dose alcohol for some individuals, even
yeah,
though they're having it with dinner
yeah.
and it's nice to have on occasion. I understand that, but
Mhm,
it can really affect your
mhm.
sleep if you're not careful.
But isn't it interesting how the data and the messaging on alcohol has changed just in the last 5 years?
Mm,
Because we used to think that it was positive, it was a positive thing to be drinking red wine because of the resveratrol, the phenols, and how it was good for heart health. And the more recent literature is not showing that. It's really showing that alcohol is something for pleasure, but it's not something for health.
hmm But sometimes that, because there's also an argument that that increase in pleasure is linked to longevity because of the reduction in stress. But then you could offset that by the reduction in
Oh, I
sleep
like that
because
argument, Ben. Yeah, I think I'll use that argument from now on.
yeah, but also it's something to highlight is that a typical wine glass that a normal Brit pours is very different to what's in the literature, which is linked to that
Mm,
longevity, right? I think
yeah,
our
the
small
little
glasses of
thimble.
wine, yeah, exactly. I think it's 75 mils or something, but our small glasses are 125, and if you're pouring it at home, you can bet that's going to be more than that.
Absolutely, yes. And then, yeah, fruit juices, of course, will also spike blood sugar. In even vegetable juices, if you drink a lot of vegetable juice, you've still got fructose, haven't you, and other types of sugars from the vegetables, but you don't have the fiber to
Mm.
slow down the absorption into the bloodstream. So lots of things can do it. Lots of things can do it.
I mean, there wasn't because do you ever follow? You might not know who he is. He's called Paul Saladino.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he wrote the Carnivore Code, and quite a lot of the information in that book he kind of takes back now. And he was on an all meat diet, and then he added in fruits and vegetables. And he now believes carbohydrates are absolutely essential for health. But he also thinks that these huge peaks in blood sugar are normal as long as they're not sustained. So if they're controlled. But I
Hmm.
argue, like, how do you get, and he cites some data around individuals which are pre diabetic taking in 50 grams of honey a day actually improve their, I think it's the HbA1c in fasting, and maybe it's not the HbA1c, but
Mm.
fasting insulin levels.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, this is hugely fascinating, but how do you get to that point without causing further damage? So I think this is just a hugely complex topic. And I think one thing which he doesn't address, which I think might be the case, is that when you change your diet where it's more nutrient dense, you are adding in nutrients which you might have been deficient in before, which caused or even exacerbated the hypoglycemia to begin with,
Yeah.
like chromium, for example, which we know is implicated in blood glucose control.
Yeah.
But I've said
Yeah.
I've
I
said a
mean, I
lot there.
think,
What do you think?
well, I mean, I can't comment on the research that you've quoted because I haven't actually read that particular research, but it's really interesting, something that I will go away and have a look at, giving me some homework. Thank you. But of course, when we're thinking about dysfunctional dysglycemia, which then can turn into metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes, it's not just about blood glucose problems. There's a lot of other things going on there. So you've got increased inflammation, you've got increased oxidative stress,
Mhm.
you've got dysfunction usually of blood lipid control. So you've got so many different things that conspire together to cause ill health and symptoms. It's not all just down to how are we metabolizing glucose. You've got liver involvement in the metabolism of fructose and uric acid. You've just got so many different things going on at the same time. So, and that's all driven by an unhealthy approach to eating and life, rather than, so for example, having a healthy diet and eating honey.
Mm.
That's not an overall unhealthy approach to life, I guess, is it? So you can see it's a very different scenario. There's just so many different things involved in metabolic dysfunction, I think.
Absolutely.
And oxidation and inflammation, are in there, and they in themselves are drivers of fatigue, drivers of exhaustion. So we've mentioned inflammation, and how that can turn into brain inflammation as well by causing a dysfunctional blood-brain barrier. But actually, oxidative stress itself can cause fatigue as well. And that's all kind of wrapped up with the way the mitochondria work, because too much oxidative stress damages mitochondrial function, and then that compromises our ability to produce ATP energy, um, and so it still comes back to the same things. We need all those lovely polyphenols because they're the most powerful. Well, they have the most powerful antioxidant effect. They're not antioxidants in themselves, by the way. A lot of this, they're not electron donors as standard antioxidants are, like, vitamin C and zinc, selenium. They will donate electrons to have an antioxidant effect. But the polyphenols, of course, they're stimulating NRF2, the transcription factor, which will then turn on genes that code for anti-inflammatory, energy-giving proteins. So they will support mitochondrial biogenesis, as well as supporting inflammation, antioxidant response, detoxification. And that in itself is all very energizing. So it comes back to that same thing that probably, I guess, Ben, you are featuring in every single podcast episode, which is fill your plate with masses of different colorful plant foods.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think Rangan Chatterjee had this brilliant chart. It was just a rainbow of colors. It's like, eat colors, to count colors, not portions of vegetables or fruits. And I was like, I love that. Love that. And it's really easy for people to follow. It's a good thing. With just when we talk about hypoglycemia, how are you measuring that in individuals? Is there certain testing that you're looking at, which you think of? Because some people like fasting blood glucose, fasting insulin, etc. Are there things which are go-tos for you when looking at that?
So I used to do oral glucose tolerance challenges, which I don't really do anymore because they're so hard for the client to go through, because you have to sit there for 2 or 3 hours and have a glucose challenge, which can put you into hypoglycemia, and then you feel really awful. I think HbA1c is a really good starting point for hyperglycemia, isn't it? It tells us, what's been happening over the last 3 months or so in terms of your ability to control blood glucose levels. But it's going to miss hypoglycemia because HbA1c just really tells you how much damage you're accumulating in your cells because your blood sugar has been too high. So it's really a marker of insulin resistance. So in terms of hypoglycemia, I'm mainly going by symptoms. I'm asking people to tell me how they feel, because you should be feeling energized all day, really, shouldn't you? You shouldn't feel that you have a slump after eating lunch. You shouldn't want to have a nap in the afternoon. You shouldn't go through periods of feeling irritable and shaky, or being desperate for your next cup of coffee. But and when I found people going into hypoglycemia without that necessarily that strong hyperglycemic episode, it's been through using continuous glucose monitoring, which some people decide to do. But what I would say about that is I don't think we have really strong data that continuous glucose monitoring is the best thing to do for people who are not diabetic, but it can still be. It can be enlightening, and I often find people going into hypoglycemia overnight, and when you show them that on their continuous glucose monitoring test results, that can be quite motivating to get them to think about, well, why am I going into hypoglycemia overnight? Is it because I'm having that glass of wine with dinner, or is it because I'm eating too much starch with dinner, or is it because actually I'm having a healthy dinner but then I'm snacking on crisps later when I'm watching Netflix till 2 a.m. So all of these things you can then look at.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, can have their place, but they just need to be, I think they can drive people to be a bit obsessive if we're not careful. Someone constantly looking, if it's not in those ranges which are considered healthy, they can say, oh, well, I'm never eating that again or something. But if you it's more the area under the curve, and I don't think that's always communicated very well to people. So even if something spikes really high and goes back down, it's not really going to have a detriment on you.
No.
But if something is elevated above the reference ranges, which are considered healthy, and then is maintained, then you might have an issue with a certain food.
Yeah, it's the length of time, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because your body has all these systems for normalizing your blood glucose, and it should be able to get you out of trouble, shouldn't it? So it's those times when it can't get you out of trouble, and you're just maintaining that imbalance. And it's so much, it's not just about specific foods, is it? Because it's all about lifestyle as well. It is about sleep and exercise and stress. They are just as important. And in fact, when you're exercising, of course, you can get insulin into your cells, you can get glucose into your cells even without insulin, because your muscles just need that glucose.
Yeah, exactly. So GLUT4 receptors are translocated when you resistance train. So these are just glucose receptors that basically come to the cell surface and then, absorb it without insulin needed, unlike other GLUT receptors. So yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. And it's quite fascinating when that happens, because you can eat high glycemic foods without actually having an increase in your blood sugar to the extent that you would normally after training, because it's just sensitized.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that people if you train, you can get away with it. But sometimes you can to a degree. Which is quite nice, if you're trying to treat yourself. That's all I'm going to say about that. With regards to supplements, is there any ones that you'd go to for helping individuals to control blood sugar? Or do you think it's more personalized and that's something that we should be?
I think it is more diet and lifestyle, because if you are heading towards insulin resistance, there are micronutrients that can help with insulin sensitization. So things like cinnamon, berberine, alpha lipoic acid, magnesium, coenzyme Q10, chromium, they've all got some evidence for supporting blood glucose normalization. But really, when you look at the trials, the participants are heading towards insulin resistance rather than just being in a hypoglycemic state. And of course, insulin resistance can make you feel very tired, and diabetes. So those micronutrients would definitely be worth looking at if you're in that state. But if you're simply getting hypoglycemia, then I really think it's about normalizing the diet and the lifestyle, and taking out the things from the diet that are telling your pancreas it needs a lot of insulin, and instead replacing those with a way more vegetables of a low glycemic type and way more protein, which is helpful. This is where it can be helpful if you are an animal protein eater, because you've got many more foods at your disposal in terms of the meat and the fish and the eggs, which are fantastic for stabilizing. They don't really push insulin that much, and lots of healthy fats, so avocados and olive oil and olives. Although, as we talked about before we came on today, Ben, I've got a horrible, painful, cracked tooth at the moment, and that was from a olive stone. So I'm not sure that olives are that healthy for me at the moment. And the lifestyle piece. And of course, if you are 100% plant-based, then tofu, again, very high in protein, so very helpful in preventing insulin spiking, or tempeh, and also, lots of beans and pulses. They've got very low glycemic load, rather than having too many whole grains on the plate, which are healthful, but it needs to be balanced, doesn't it, with more protein? Otherwise, you can still have a blood glucose insulin spike from the concentrated starches in the whole grains.
We've mentioned a lot so far in relation to nutrient deficiencies, gut issues, hypoglycemia, and we're up to an hour now.
Wow.
Is there anything else which you'd like to touch on? Because I'm conscious there are many different facets to this, but any major things that we should dive into?
So I suppose HPA dysfunction and HPT dysfunction, it's worth just mentioning. So the HPA is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So if you've been under long-term stress, then that can severely worsen fatigue. And there are various mechanisms. I mean, would you like me to just kind of run through those mechanisms, Ben?
Yeah, we can dive into them as long as you want, Lorraine. I'm here for it.
Okay. Okay, so chronic stress. So when we're under chronic stress, we tend to overproduce adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol. And in the long term, that can drive fatigue. And so one mechanism can be the effect on sleep. For example, a very basic mechanism can be an effect on sleep, because if you've got elevated cortisol and adrenaline, as I mentioned earlier, they are antagonistic to melatonin. So in the evenings, one of the things that gets you to sleep, there's two things that really get us to sleep. It's a melatonin rise, which is linked to the circadian rhythm, and it's also the rise of adenosine, which is a chemical that just builds up the number of hours that we've been awake during the day. So in order to have the melatonin rise, we need we need to be living according to the dark light cycle. So the dark comes and that triggers melatonin. But also, one of the things that might prevent that melatonin rising is cortisol being high, because they are antagonistic to each other. So cortisol in a healthy circadian rhythm is going to be really high in the morning when you wake up. So we bounce out of bed, and then it's going to be very low by the time we go to bed at night. So long-term stress can prevent that cortisol going down at night. And then, of course, we might not get the sleep that we want. It might take us ages to get to sleep. And that will be a driver of fatigue. So that's one way in which chronic stress can worsen fatigue. Another way is the blood glucose thing that we've just mentioned. Yeah, so we've talked about the fact that hypoglycemia can make us feel exhausted, and chronic stress causes that. We've mentioned that. The mechanism is that when we are under stress, the adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol will tell the pancreas tell the liver to undergo a process called glycogenolysis, whereby the glycogen in the liver is broken down and released as glucose into the bloodstream, to give us lots of energy so we can go and fight whatever bear we've come across that day. And so that by that mechanism, chronic stress will then spike blood sugar. And then, of course, that will spike insulin, and insulin will drag all that glucose into the cells. And before we know it, we've crashed into hypoglycemia again. So that's another mechanism. A third mechanism is through the thyroid. So the thyroid produces hormones that speed our metabolism and make us feel energized. So essentially, the pituitary gland produces thyroid stimulating hormone that gets the thyroid to produce T4. T4 is then converted to T3, which is the active energy-giving metabolic hormone. But when we've got elevated levels of cortisol, that cortisol can interfere with the conversion of T4 into active T3, and instead can shunt it into a different pathway where it produces something called reverse T3. And reverse T3 can bind the T3 receptors, down regulating active T3 function. So we can slow our metabolism, and we can feel very tired because of that. So that's another mechanism by which so you might get hypothyroid symptoms, but perhaps there's nothing actually wrong with the thyroid gland. It could be driven by elevated cortisol. So it should be the HPA axis you address rather than the thyroid axis. And then there is a concept as well, Ben, just a fourth mechanism that I'm going to float with you, but I don't know I don't think we have really good evidence for it at the moment, but it's something that is floated in the literature, which is this concept of cortisol resistance, whereby you can have elevated levels of cortisol, but you might not get the energy giving effects of that cortisol, because it might be that over time our cells become resistant to accepting all that cortisol, in the same way that if we have a high glycemic diet for many years, our cells become resistant to insulin, or if we overeat for many years, our hypothalamus becomes resistant to leptin, so we can no longer control our appetite. Or if we can even our dopamine receptors can downregulate, can't we? If we're taking stimulants that really overstimulate dopamine. So it's a kind of physiological response that makes sense if our cells are bombarded with cortisol all the time. to an excessive level, then would they downregulate their acceptance of it? And it's worth thinking about, because you often do get people who are overproducing cortisol, but they feel really tired.
Yes. The way that you've put it there, especially with leptin and also insulin resistance over time, it makes sense that this would be the case. However, testing for it is going to be remarkably difficult, right?
Yeah. That's why I don't want to sit here and say this is something that's definitely happening in our patients, because I don't know really how we would test for that. Well, I mean, the tests that are available to us as nutrition practitioners are tests for what cortisol you're producing, but they don't necessarily tell you what your cells are doing, how sensitive your cells are to that cortisol, as far as I'm aware. So you can plot your circadian rhythm in terms of cortisol by measuring cortisol at different times during the day, but how you are then working, and you can look at cortisol metabolism, because you can look at the metabolites that are coming out in the urine, but how your cells are actually responding appropriately to that cortisol, I don't know whether we can measure that. That's not my area of expertise, really.
I think it's a really important point to bring up, though, because it's an area that practitioners might not think about. They might not know it exists, and therefore they can look into it and maybe look at other ways they can modulate cortisol.
Yeah. And when we're working with people with long-term stress, and we might do a hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis function test, for example, we might do that circadian rhythm of cortisol output. Of course, when we're trying to help somebody, it's not about trying to change. It's not about thinking that there's anything wrong with the adrenal glands. It's about looking at what is driving the brain to tell the adrenal glands to overproduce cortisol. And I think it was that there's some key things to look at there, and they would be things like ongoing inflammation, which we've mentioned, glycemic dysregulation, which we've also mentioned, circadian disruption. So, for example, night shift workers or just not sleeping, and then that kind of perceived stress or rumination, which is how you're interpreting the world around you. And those would be the things to work on before thinking about supplements, really, for adrenal function or HPA function.
Yeah, that's such a valid point. Yeah, night shift work is a whole other ball game and very hard to manage, especially like you mentioned before. Insulin resistance is rife in that community, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because you need to be living according to that light dark cycle. It's so hard to get everything optimal if you're not. So one of the things, Ben, that I usually point people to when the HPA axis is out of function is the blue zones research. Yeah, what are all the things that we need for a happy, healthy HPA axis? And they are things like going out into nature, having good relationships, getting enough rest, getting sufficient exercise, not too little but not too much, having a nourishing diet. But it's not about being really picky with what you're eating or really controlled over having to take certain doses of certain supplements. Sometimes it might be, but in the main, it's about getting that balance, redressing the imbalances in life in general, and thinking about, what am I lacking? Am I lacking sleep, or am I lacking joy? When was the last time I had a good laugh? That sort of laughing when you're a child, when you're in some teacher's class and you're not allowed to laugh, and you literally are splitting your sides. You cannot stop. You cannot hold in your laughter. And when was the last time that you felt like that? It's those sorts of things, I think, that are important.
I love that sentiment. Big shout out to Netflix with all the comedy shows on there. No, I'm joking.
Yeah.
I think that highlights the need for good quality social interactions and relationships more so than anything.
Absolutely.
Not just Netflix.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Unless you've got all your mates around to watch something with you that you're all addicted to.
That is a good point. That's a good point as well. Lorraine, I have to say this has been an absolute joy to have you on the show. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. But before you go, can you please tell the listeners where they can find you and what exciting projects you have coming up?
Okay, well, where can you find me? I have a website, which is lorrainenicollenutrition.co.uk. I'm afraid I don't do very much social media at all. I do occasionally post on LinkedIn, but not doing anything else at the moment. So I'm trying to look after my joy. So one of the ways is not to do too much social media. I get too drawn into it, and I know that's not probably very healthy. And exciting projects coming up. So I do quite a lot of teaching that practitioners can join in with. So I work with a group called CPD UK, where we do mentoring and clinical supervision, and any practitioners can sign up. There is a small fee, but you can come to the clinical conversations for a very small fee. And I do some webinars and also full day face-to-face seminars for a company called Pharma Nord, and we always have a lot of fun at those full days that we do. So yeah, a few other things coming up, but I suppose those are the sort of imminent things that are happening right now at the moment.
Wonderful. And final question before you leave, Lorraine, and I've not prepped you for this, but what is the most what's the most impactful health change that you have made in your life ever, and why?
Oh my goodness.
I know, it's a big one, isn't it?
I think I'm going to say that it probably is that joy thing. It's that remembering to do something joyful. I actually had something happen to me a few years ago that really taught me the importance of this, which I never used to talk about, and I've only recently started talking about it because it's so far behind me. I don't know whether we've got time. Would you like me to talk about this, or shall we?
As long as you're comfortable, I'm very happy to hear.
Okay. I mean, I am very comfortable now talking about it. It really taught me a huge amount, and I think hopefully it will help other people as well. But I developed really severe exhaustion from a chronic pain syndrome. This is many years ago now. I had this chronic pain syndrome where my arms were in absolute agony, all the way down from my neck, all the way down my arms into my fingers. And it was really, really severe pain. I mean, absolutely agonizing pain, which went on for months. And I had every single test you can possibly think of, including nerve conduction tests, MRI scans, X-rays, PET, CT scans, the whole lot. I saw lots of different consultants, many other types of therapists, and nobody could find anything that was wrong with me. And I thought I was going mad, but my pain was so severe that I couldn't sleep, and I also couldn't really work. I had a wonderful nutrition colleague came into clinic with me, and would be writing my client reports because I couldn't write. And it was really ruining my life, and I was feeling just absolutely exhausted, dead with exhaustion. And then a friend of a friend recommended I went to see a chap in Bristol who was a physiotherapist, but he worked in spinal units with people with severe spinal problems and spinal injuries, and he specialized in upper body pain. And he put me through masses of different tests. I had a 3-hour appointment with him. And at the end of all of that, he said to me, "You don't have anything that we can treat with medicine. You don't have any named sort of disease that needs a medical treatment. You have what we call pectoral neurogenic pectoral syndrome, which is a type of thoracic outlet syndrome." He said what was happening to me was through overactive HPA axis, so long-term stress, the pectoral muscles had switched on, and nothing I did would switch them off. They just would not switch off. So the whole of the brachial plexus, which is the nervous system that comes from the neck down through the armpits down into the hands, was being clenched, causing this excruciating pain. And I said, "Well, what do I do about this?" And he said, "Well, you need to think about what makes you feel really joyful and relaxed. And of course, this has been going on for months, so I wasn't feeling joyful and relaxed at all. And I did tell him one thing that did make me feel joyful and relaxed. It happened to be dancing, and he said, "Okay, well, you have to do that every single day, and that is your prescription, and you have to do it, and you have to do it to the music that makes you feel like you want to do it." And within about 3 weeks, I was better. I was completely better.
That's amazing.
I know, it's such a bonkers story. If somebody was to tell me that story, I don't think I would believe them. But it's 100% true.
That's incredible. I love stories like that, especially when the solution is simple, but specific and effective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that really sent me down a rabbit hole of trying to understand about pain. And I did a lot of looking into resources on what we call central nervous system hypersensitivity, where when you're in long-term pain, that is exacerbated by your brain then becoming really sensitized to that pain and heightening that pain. And then you can't get out of that pain cycle, and something needs to break that cycle. And the first stage is often the switch being that you do feel safe and you stop being anxious about the pain. And often that comes through education. So seeing somebody that I really trusted who was to say to me, "But you don't have a disease. You definitively do not have an actual disease. You have overtight pectoral." And because I trusted him and he educated me, that switched that switch.
Wow.
And then I suppose the relaxation through doing the joyful dancing just helped everything to start switching off. I know it is quite bonkers, and so I've been a bit embarrassed about telling it now and then, and now I just think, well, it's true, and it might be helpful for some people to know that sometimes there is light at the end of the tunnel, even if you think there isn't.
Yes, exactly. Well, I am so glad that you're better and you're no longer dealing with that. Are you still dancing every day out of interest?
No, I probably that's the thing. I probably need to. I do need to get back and start doing that. Yeah.
No, that is absolutely incredible. And I think also just subjectively, when I'm doing things that I really enjoy, all my stresses just seem to melt away sometimes.
Yeah. It's so powerful, valuable. Isn't it?
And quite often when I'm really stressed, though, I will be, quote unquote, too busy to spend that time. Or not make enough time for that, and probably exacerbates the situation.
Yes. Yeah, the fact you recognise that, Ben, means you've got to make yourself do it, doesn't it? And with those times when we really don't feel like going out and seeing people, are the times that we've got to make ourselves do it, because you don't ever regret doing that, do you?
No.
You think, "Oh, I haven't got time, I'm too busy, I'm too stressed," but you always feel better afterwards, having that human connection and just that laughter.
Yes, I completely agree with you. Completely agree. Lorraine, that was an absolutely beautiful story. Thank you very much for sharing it. I'll be dancing immediately after this.
Oh yeah. Brilliant. Good.
Thanks so much for coming on the... Sorry, go on. I'll let you finish.
I was going to say thank you very much, Ben. It's been really interesting having this discussion. I feel really honoured that you've invited me on.
My absolute pleasure, and it really was. Okay, everyone, until next time. Thank you for listening to the Functional Health Podcast. You can find links to everything that we talked about today in the show notes. If you have a second, please consider leaving a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really does make a huge difference and helps get this valuable information out and reach more people. Don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date and know whenever I release a new episode. You can connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, or our website, and all questions are welcome. As always, thanks to Josh Aurelia for all the editing, and thank you all for your support.